Welcome to Eye for Iran. For the first time since the Iran-Iraq War, the Islamic Republic has activated its National Defense Council. Does that signal wartime strategy or desperation? Is Tehran preparing for the next phase of conflict? And how does the Trump administration view the council? Meantime, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance insists America is not at war with Iran, only with its nuclear facilities. So what does that mean? And Israel is warning of new threats as its international standing is weakened just as tensions with Iran reach a new high. Joining me today is Len Khodorkovsky. He served in the U.S. State Department under President Trump, working closely with the Special Representative for Iran during Trump's first administration. He helped craft Washington's messaging during the height of the maximum pressure campaign. Today on Eye for Iran, we ask, is the Islamic Republic bluffing, or are we looking at the opening moves of the next Middle East war?
I'm sure the regime thinks it's a wartime strategy, but at the end of the day, it's a fig leaf.
And also, what does U.S. messaging look like right now with Iran? I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Len Khodorkovsky joins us now. Thank you so much for being here on Eye for Iran.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you played a pivotal role during the first Trump administration in terms of the messaging and direct communication with the people of Iran during your time at the State Department. Walk us through your role.
I think it's important for people to know that whenever you set a policy, whether it comes to Iran or any other country, that it has multiple components, multiple prongs. There's obviously the diplomatic prong, the military prong, but there's also a communications prong. Because it's not enough to have a policy, you need to be able to communicate it to both its intended audience and the rest of the world. So that was my job. My job was to communicate the maximum pressure campaign strategy of the first Trump administration, not just to our friends and allies around the world, but directly to the people in Iran, so that they would understand that the strategy wasn't aimed at them, it was aimed at the regime oppressing them. And it was very important to President Trump and the whole administration that was not forgotten, that all the disinformation and propaganda by the regime and its allies, that the maximum pressure campaign is somehow, intended to hurt the Iranian people, needed to be at the very least neutralized. And, if we were successful, and hopefully we were to some extent, to explain exactly what we were doing, why we were doing it, and why it was not meant, it was not targeted at the Iranian population.
And what was the feedback like? Like, what were your interactions like? Did they feel that, or did they feel like sanctions were making their lives worse? What was the experience like for you?
Well, because I felt very confident that we were successfully reaching the people on the ground, both based on all of the platforms that the U.S. government has to reach inside any country, but also anecdotally and through traditional media sources. While you cannot reach every possible person in anywhere, I felt comfortable that the messaging did reach a substantial portion of the population, that their actions inside of Iran demonstrated that they understood our strategy. You've seen their reaction played over and over again in recent conflicts where the regime tried to position actions against the regime as if they're actions against the Iranian quote-unquote nation. And the people on the ground clearly differentiated and disagreed through their actions by not only not rallying around the flag, but also making life more difficult for the regime. So I feel There is a way to do that, and communication strategy plays a large role in it, not just when it comes to Iran, but my personal background is I came from the Soviet Union to the United States during the Cold War. And during that time, the United States had a very robust communication strategy aimed at the people inside the Soviet bloc. I remember my parents struggling to hear the voice of America or Radio Free Europe, to hear the truth during that conflict, and it made a big difference in terms of explaining to them why the United States was doing what it was doing, and that it was on their side. So I took the lessons from my youth, and I tried to build them into our strategy, put myself, so to speak, in the shoes of people being oppressed. What would they want to know? What would they want to learn? And what information could be helpful to them as they're undergoing a hardship?
So that inspired you then, and could possibly give you a connection, I guess, to the people of Iran living both under authoritarian, oppressive governments?
Yeah, I believe so. I think my own personal experience, growing up under an oppressive tyranny of the Soviet communism, has certainly left an impression on me, and created solidarity with all people yearning for freedom. And of course, that includes the people in Iran.
So what was it for you as a child that kind of did it for you that you're trying then to employ to the people of Iran?
Well, I think the most important ingredient that any oppressed people need to have is hope, that they're not alone, that somebody hears them, that their struggle is not in vain. And regardless of whether the United States or anybody else is willing to do anything beyond just communicating those things, that in and of itself is an extremely important support for people who are struggling. I'll take it into personal relationships. It's the same idea. When your friend is feeling pain or hurt, it's important for that person to know they're not alone, and that goes a long way, especially when the United States, the beacon of freedom in the world. To me, United States is synonymous with freedom. And when a powerful, free nation like that empathizes and communicates with you and tells you that you're not alone, that goes a long way. Now, put on top of that policy measures like economic pressure on your oppressors, or diplomatic pressure on your oppressors, or even military action against your oppressors. Those things, of course, build on top of that security blanket. But the most important thing is hope and knowing you're not alone. And that's really the most important lesson that I took away and wanted to inject into our strategy.
So what do you think? I mean, you're not at the State Department right now, and you're not working for the Trump administration at the moment. So what do you think of Trump's messaging during this administration? I mean, you've got, for example, I heard Vice President J.D. Vance just a few weeks ago say, we're not at war with the Islamic Republic. We're at war with their nuclear facilities. I mean, what does that even really mean? And then there are certain policies, for example, speaking obviously anonymously to some university students in Iran who got accepted to Ivy League schools, and they've just been on hold for some of them almost more than a year in background searches, et cetera, because there's effectively been a freeze on admitting Iranian students to American universities. And then, of course, you've got a U.S. senator who's trying to put forward a bill to effectively ban all students coming from Iran. So how do you see the messaging coming from the Trump administration right now to the people of Iran?
Look, I instead of trying to explain something that I'm not privy to, because I'm not in the room making those decisions, I'm going to try and explain America's perspective. So the perspective of the United States is we are in a contest around the world with authoritarian regimes, including Iran, that are that have its goal in displacing the United States and undermining the interests of the United States. Unfortunately, Iran is one of the top three, I would say: China, Russia, Iran. And the United States policymakers have to take that into consideration when they make their policy. Now, practically speaking, in terms of students, I would say that nothing is permanent. There is no permanent policy, whether it comes to students or sanctions or anything like that. The policy is aimed to achieve a specific objective. Now, as far as the American population goes, when you hear things like, threats from the Iranian regime, when you see assassination attempts on the president from the Iranian regime, when you're seeing regularly that foreign entities are stealing our intellectual property and sensitive research, and are embedded in universities. Not to say these are Iranian students that are doing that, but there are certainly enough cases where PhD students from those countries have been discovered to try and undermine our interests. So when it comes to that, unfortunately, a policy can't be made on a case-by-case basis. It has to be made, in many ways through, broad strokes of, laws or regulations. And that's the case, I think, when it comes to this. Beyond that, I think Iranian government has been implicated in the turmoil on college campuses as well, certainly since October 7th, but much longer than that. So when the administration is paying attention to those kinds of signals, it's you can't expect it to use a scalpel necessarily when it comes to this policy. And so sometimes it's going to end up being a sledgehammer. And, unfortunately, bad apples tend to spoil it for everybody. And in this case, that's what's happening. As far as the focus of the policy of this administration on the regime in general, I think the president has stated himself his primary focus is to alleviate the nuclear threat from the regime. He's always said that. He said that in the first administration. He said that now. The difference is he actually has acted beyond the economic pressure on the regime in the second administration, to the extent where he took military action to address his primary concern. Now, that means that the president is not necessarily going to be a builder of a democracy in Iran. He or his administration are not interested in being in rebuilding the Iran of the past to bring back its rich heritage.
Well, that's an interesting point, because would that not, in terms of your expertise of messaging, would that not potentially risk alienating the people of Iran? Because at the end of the day, they really don't care. Everyday regular Iranians don't care about the nuclear facilities, and that is not related to domestic oppression or repression as well. So what does that do in terms of messaging for the people itself?
Well, I think, truth is important to the people. So the people need to be clear where the United States stands. And if I am constructing a strategy in terms of communicating with the people in Iran, it's built on facts. So it's not up to the messaging team in the administration to decide that. It's up to the president and Secretary of State to work together to construct the policy, and for the messaging team to explain that policy to the world, including people in Iran. Now, what I would say, though, is that the president hasn't really deviated from that message since the first administration. He has never said he is for nation building. He's always put his priority on the nuclear threat from the regime, and the entire maximum pressure campaign during the first administration and today is aimed at preventing the regime from threatening the citizens of the United States. That's the American government's primary objective. Now, it's important for the people in Iran to understand that. Of course, the primary objective of the government of Iran should be the welfare of Iranian people. It's not. So in that respect, is
the operative.
should be, of course. And what the people are seeing is a big disconnect between what it should be and what it is, which is why the regime is in such a precarious situation today and has been for the last, 5 to 10 years on the spiral toward what I believe is its last chapter, because fundamentally, the people in Iran have given up on this Islamic revolutionary regime delivering on its promises and conducting themselves as if they care about the people's welfare. But, we can discuss that more specifically. But in terms of communicating America's policy, what is important is not, is certainly words of clarity. The president has said that, his job is to protect the American people and to prevent the regime from attaining a nuclear weapon. He's acted on that in all of those aspects, both, diplomatically, economically, militarily, and continues to put pressure on the regime. He's also, let's be honest, he broke the taboo by floating the idea of regime change in Iran just in the last few weeks. Now, when I served in the first Trump administration, no one uttered those words, regime change, even though, people wanted to hear that and people couldn't understand why the Trump administration wouldn't go so far as to say those things. Wasn't it like the most obvious way to alleviate the big problem facing the United States? Well, that taboo has been broken. Actually, a couple of taboos have been broken. First, the military action that the president took against the nuclear facilities in Iran, that is not something to be taken lightly.
That's very significant.
Extremely significant. And second is just saying the words regime change. Now, that is a communication strategy. Now, don't undersell the importance of the president of the United States saying the words regime change, because once you say it, you can't unsay it. So now that is on the table. I'm sure the regime officials have noted those words, and their decision making is taking that into consideration, or it should be. Let's just say the communication strategy from Trump 2.0 is different than Trump 1.0, but in some ways it's become much more powerful and direct, as demonstrated by those two things.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how the regime is reacting. This week, the big news was that Iran set up a National Defense Council. What does that signal to you?
Not much, because...
Tell me more.
At the end of the day, we know that the final say on all policy rests with Ali Khamenei. Now, on paper, that's always it might be diffused among various bodies under Khamenei, but in reality, he is the regime's defense minister. He is the regime's foreign minister. He is the regime's economic minister. He is the last word on all policy related to the regime. These days, I think things are a little bit more interesting, because I think the 12-day war between Iran and Israel have taken a large toll on Khamenei and the regime, not just by decimating a lot of the leadership literally taking them off the battlefield, not just by decimating a lot of the proxies that the regime built its empire on, but I think it's taken a heavy toll on the supreme leader. And, there's reporting of him being ill. And there's reporting of him not being as engaged as he's been. So it's a little bit unclear where the final word is, or whether there is more chaos and more infighting these days, because the regime is not as sturdy as it used to be, at least in its decision-making capacity. I am sure the IRGC is still at the forefront of decision-making when it comes to the projection of regime's power, both inside and outside, but it's less clear to what extent Khamenei is awake or involved in the day-to-day decision-making. I think there are other signs that point to the regime being at the weakest point since the revolution. Certainly, the decimation of its air defenses has proven that, the emperor has no clothes. Certainly, the decimation of Hamas, Hezbollah, the fall of Assad have all contributed to the dissolution of the regime's 46-year plan to project its power in the neighborhood. Certainly, its economy is teetering on breakdown. We're seeing issues with water shortages, electric shortages. There's problem after problem after problem within the country, and altogether, I think this points to the fundamentals, pointing us toward the inevitable collapse. Now, if you were to, let's say Iran were a company and you were an investor, and you were looking at this company where the entire leadership of the company just, left, whether they wanted to leave or not, they left. Whether you're seeing the people inside the company lose complete faith and hope and interest in supporting the company. You're seeing its partnerships dissolve. So whatever you do, whether you stand up the Defense Council, whether you change the name of the currency, or anything that you try and do to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, the ship is still sinking. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the regime that's desperate and flailing away in various ways to try and preserve its control and its hold on power. And, if I were analyzing a private company that were falling apart like this, I would say, I'm certainly not investing in it. I would recommend that my clients don't invest in it, or my friends invest in it. And it's just a matter of time before it falls apart. And I believe that the die has been cast. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when all of these fundamentals add up to the collapse of the regime.
So then you see this National Defense Council as a desperate move, more optics than anything else. You don't see this as a wartime strategy potentially?
Well, I'm sure the regime thinks it's a wartime strategy, but at the end of the day, it's a fig leaf. First of all, it signifies that its defense strategy of 46 years has failed. Whatever power, whatever decision-making mechanism existed up until now has utterly failed and has been uncloaked through Israel's actions, through America's actions, to reveal that the regime is more bark than bite. So to that extent, that's not something you can rebuild by creating some bureaucracy that's going to all of a sudden fix all of these things. It's not going to do that. As we said, it'd be beyond a lot of the leadership, both military leadership, political leadership, certainly Ali Khamenei's mental state, are all in question. That is not something a new bureaucracy is going to fix overnight. Even if this body succeeded in living up to all of the hopes of the people who conceived of it, it's going to take time, and that's the time that the regime does not have.
So if you're still in U.S. government, and this happened, let's say, during the first Trump administration when you were there, how would you view this National Defense Council? Would you see this as something like just you would ignore it and whatever and move on? Or do you see this as something that's defensive or aggressive? Like, how would this translate then into American policy, if at all?
Yeah, I feel confident that we would ignore the optics and we would focus on the substance of, has any substance changed with standing up of this new bureaucracy? Sitting here today, I can say that no substance has been changed, which means our policy should not be altered based on the creation of this new bureaucracy. Therefore, full steam ahead.
So this is all part of Iran's messaging too, right?
Well, absolutely. But I don't think the people in Iran are putting faith in this new body.
Or would buy it,
Yeah, I think the only people who are probably, sold on the genius of standing up this new bureaucracy that's meaningless are the people who are now going to be part of it. But I don't think any observers, Iran watchers outside of Iran or inside Iran think that this is a game changer in any way. It's not. It's, as I said, it's pure cosmetic reshuffling of personnel that is meaningless.
A facelift, if you will. When it comes to you mentioning, the regime, the Islamic Republic is on its last legs, on the verge of collapse, I have to ask you this, and this is a question that the people of Iran ask me all the time, and I certainly don't have the answer. Why is it then that the government of Iran is able to have such a strong hold still against its own population? Why is it that domestically they are as, oppressive as ever? Regionally, yeah, they've been weakened, but how does that actually impact Iranians in terms of their day-to-day life and for them to see change?
Well, they have the guns. So, when you lose the carrots, you have to double down on the sticks. So as the Iranian economy has sputtered, as the regime has mismanaged its natural resources, as that has become clear, your stranglehold on power is less and less in your legitimacy as the representative of the people, and more as an authoritarian mechanism, just desperate to maintain control by any means necessary. That's what's happening now. I think you're over the years, over the decades, there have been recurring protests in Iran, gradually recognizing the reality that this regime is not the solution for Iran's future or the next generation. Today's generation of Iranians is not even connected to the revolution and its promises. So they're much more plugged into the rest of the world than the previous generations have been. They're seeing the neighborhood around them realize their potential. An example being, the Abraham Accords, where their Arab neighbors are taking advantage of the opportunities and the innovation of the neighborhood to lift up their populations, and they're watching their own government both not only not take advantage of those opportunities, but to lose ground on the rest of the neighborhood. And they're asking themselves, why should we be losing all of this ground? Why should we be stuck in this predicament that disregards our natural and human resources in the country and all the promise? The only thing standing between us and the future that we deserve is this regime that hasn't accomplished a thing, that's only stays in power by killing us, by not delivering on the basic role of any government. So I suspect that we haven't seen the last of the protests in Iran. Obviously, the question is, and we don't know when that straw that's going to break the camel's back is going to happen. We don't know that. We didn't know that in the case of the Soviet Union, when one day,
yeah, that's a great example.
It was a threat to the free world, and the next day it didn't exist. And the same goes to any revolution. One day Assad is in power, the next day he's not in power. That happens all the time, and we haven't successfully predicted a revolution yet. Or a change of regime yet. And I don't think we know when the Iranian people are going to decide that this is the last day. However, I think, as I said, if I am an outside analyst and I'm watching what's happening, that is my conclusion, that even though I don't know the day that the Iranian people decide to take their destiny in their own hands, or the regime simply collapses of its own ineptitude and mismanagement, like, in many ways the Soviet Union did. The weight of its economic mismanagement became so heavy that it collapsed, and largely collapsed without any foreign invasion, there were some cases, like in Romania, where there was some action that was violent, but in many cases it just happened. So I think we should focus less on predicting the exact hour and the day of when the regime is going to go away, and focus on common sense and fundamentals that never fail. And these fundamentals have pointed to this inevitability before, and they're pointing to this inevitability in the case of Iran. And I think any serious people should just do what they can to usher in as peacefully as possible the day when Iran can rejoin the community of nations, when the Iranian people can benefit from all of the treasure that the country possesses, of their own natural talents, and contributes value toward the global economy. And there's a lot to talk about there. There's a lot that Iran has to offer economically. There's a lot that Iran can offer technologically, scientifically. So the upside in investment in a free Iran is enormous. And I suspect that the largest companies in the world will be knocking on the door the second they see that as a realistic possibility.
And you mentioned the Abraham Accords. Trump actually on Thursday said that all countries in the Middle East should join the Abraham Accords because of Iran. What did you make of that?
Look, the president is an aspirational speaker. I think the idea that all the nations should join in and gain maximum value out of their relationships, I think we all want that. We all want peace. We all want prosperity for our loved ones. And that's the president's natural inclination, that if he could design the world so that there is a deal that benefits the United States and every single country in the world, he would. Now, unfortunately, there are regimes and criminals and malign actors in the world that are not interested in those things, and the Iranian regime is a good example. Unfortunately, despite President Trump wanting Iran or any other country to join some sort of a organization or group of countries that cumulatively benefit from economic cooperation, I think naturally that's what we want. That's what everybody wants. But we live in the real world, and sometimes we have to recognize that. We have to look at Iran not the way we want it to be, but the way it is. And the way it is today is under the oppression of a anti-American, anti-Western, revolutionary, violent entity. And we have to treat that entity as a threat. And that's what the president has reluctantly proven that he's willing to do. Now, when I say reluctantly, I mean, yes, the president would like, as he said in his post, he wants MIGA. He wants to make Iran great again. That means that Iran should fully participate in becoming a great nation again by collaborating both with the United States and our friends and its neighbors in achieving its full potential. However, he's also displayed that he's willing to take specific action to mitigate the threats from the realistic threat of the regime by, for example, taking out Qasem Soleimani when he needed to do that, by taking military action against nuclear facilities of the regime, by, if you remember, in the case of Assad, for example, he fired 59 missiles at his chemical arsenal. He took action to displace ISIS from Syria and Iraq by through military means as well. So he took out al-Baghdadi, if you remember, as well.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So this president is a reluctant user of military force, but he would much prefer to resolve things diplomatically when possible. In the case of the regime, so far it has not been possible, which is why the United States policy is what it has been. Now, if there's one thing that we know that's been proven over the last 46 years, is the regime is simply incapable of evolving. Even after the 12-day war, when the door has been opened and Trump has stopped short of tipping the regime over the edge, the regime had a second chance to say, all right, well, we'll learn from this. We no longer have our air defenses. We've lost most of our proxies. Our economy is falling apart. Shouldn't we, at the very least, pretend like we're going to adjust our policy to avoid the pressure that's coming from the United States and its friends, including the Europeans, who are much more prepared to put pressure back on Iran than they were during Trump 1.0. If the regime were truly interested in evolving, it would do something about it. But the words coming out of the regime are, well, so what that the United States damaged our nuclear facility, we'll just rebuild them. So what that our economy is falling apart, we have a resistance economy. Unfortunately, as we saw during the 12-day conflict, neither China nor Russia came to the defense of Iran. So Iran, the regime has no friends. The regime has no internal spine or support. The regime's true believers have been decimated. The regime's partners have been decimated. Now, if you're a logical observer of the situation, I don't know how you can see that and say that there's a long-term view of an entity like this surviving and prospering. I just don't see it, and which is why I'm so bullish on the inevitable collapse of the regime.
And the Europeans, you're right, their mood or attitude towards Iran has definitely changed in the last few years. And the snapback mechanisms, the deadline is looming. How would that affect policy in Washington?
Well, I think it would support the Washington policy. So instead of the United States and the Europeans or other members of JCPOA being out of sync, we will be in sync. That will only make life for the regime much more difficult. That will make harder for the regime to obtain weapons. That'll make it harder for the regime to obtain loans. That is going to make it more complicated for the regime to function on, in legitimate global markets. It's only going to put more pressure on the regime, and considering what we just discussed, where there isn't much there, that is only going to make life more difficult for the regime. Now, I think while all of that, the pressure that the Europeans will put on the regime is significant in its own way. I think it's ultimately up to the people inside the country to decide whether they've had it, whether this is too much pressure, whether they're no longer willing to suffer the decisions of their oppressors. And I think they're going to have to decide what they want. But as far as the international community is, I think what snapback will signal is the reversion back to the pre-JCPOA days, when the international community viewed the regime as a pariah, without any ifs, ands, or buts. And it will, force the regime into some soul searching. And I am not confident that even facing that isolation, that the regime is going to decide to change its stripes. It's not going to. It can't help itself. Add to that the inevitability of the supreme leader leaving us sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later. That's going to contribute to a lot of chaos inside the country. The decision-making capability inside the country is going to be up for grabs. I think we're looking at a tumultuous period for the regime in a foreseeable future. The question is, when is that day when the regime simply can no longer sustain the pressure, both internal pressure and external pressure. But that pressure is coming.
So 2025 could be the year of change.
It could be next week.
And I really wanted to ask you about Ali Larijani, because he's been making headlines this week. He's, an ultra-conservative hardliner, but he's also known as being a very pragmatic man who is open to diplomacy and etc. He is now the head of Iran's National Security Council, and this Defense Council that we spoke of is just under the Security Council. And he's just today been appointed the representative for Khamenei at that Security Council. And that's very interesting, because you were talking about how Khamenei is not feeling well. We don't ultimately know where the decision-making lies. So how do you view this reshuffle, and what does this say to you, especially the fact that he's now the representative, quote unquote, for Khamenei at the Security Council? Does that mean Khamenei is not able to make his own decisions and he's putting all his trust in this man?
I don't think so. I think it's reshuffling the deck chairs, as we say. I think these are desperate actions by the regime to try and preserve any validity or competency. Larijani has been in power before. We know that IRGC is not going to surrender any of its internal control voluntarily. I think if you're just trying to read any cosmetic shuffling of personnel internally as any large sign that the regime is changing its stripes, I think we'd be foolish to do that. I don't see that as a significant move at all. I don't think all of a sudden the regime is going to change its nature. Well, not necessarily change its nature, but does it speak to Khamenei's capabilities or abilities right now?
and the power structure within Iran, with Larijani kind of reappearing. Like you said, like he was the head of the Security Council almost 2 decades ago, but he had a falling out with then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Does this mean something in terms of the power structure in Iran? Not necessarily that they're going to change face or suddenly be a different regime, but what does it say of Khamenei himself?
I don't think we know yet. What we do know is what we've seen, how we've seen the regime react during the 12-day conflict with Israel, which is they sent their relatives overseas. Many of them, I'm sure, have made plans to escape if they needed to. They have, I'm sure, moved their money in a place where they can have it if the regime collapsed. I don't think the fundamentals have changed with this move or any other move that the regime has taken. The only thing that I think we can learn from this or any other move since the war is that the best hope that the regime internally is willing to project to the outside world is they're willing to cosmetically change masks and reshuffle people in various positions to project some sort of meaningless propaganda to the outside world. But practically speaking, the IRGC is still in power. Whether the supreme leader is, has his full mental capacity or fully healthy, which he is not, the structure of the regime is built on the strength of the IRGC. And to the extent that the IRGC still has control of the apparatus, nothing has changed, and nothing will change. At some point, however, even the most diehard believers of the regime will see that the end is near. And we've seen that play out, in history over and over and over. We've seen that, and certainly when the communist world collapsed in the 80s. We've seen that in Syria, the regime simply collapsed and Assad just went away. There will come a day when the power structure in Iran, IRGC foremost among them, will determine that the day is near when the regime is over, and that's when it will be over. So Larijani in and of himself is a cosmetic fig leaf, but not any sign that structurally that the regime is sturdier than it was before the 12-day conflict with Israel.
But even with this, cosmetic fig leaf, as you mentioned, and propaganda, would that help the United States and Iran move towards some sort of negotiated deal? Because Trump is not, hiding the fact that he does want to come to a deal. Like, as you said, he doesn't necessarily want to go to war. Or do you foresee more war, especially with this, set up the National Defense Council may indicate that Iran sees that more war is coming. Like, how do you see this all shaping out in the weeks and the months to come?
I don't think the regime can help itself in terms of changing its nature. The nature of the regime is, and you've seen it in the words of various regime officials since the conflict, halted, where they're simply unwilling to give up its nuclear program. They're unwilling to.
Arafchi said on Fox that he wouldn't get rid of enrichment. Yeah,
I mean that's simply not in the cards. Now, if all of a sudden the regime is so desperate that for a limited period of time, it plays along and allows, the UN officials to have more access than it has, which it will scrape and claw and delay by any means necessary. That's what it will only succeed in doing, delay the inevitable, because it cannot be seen as surrendering the one thing that they've been able to use to negotiate with the rest of the world, which is the threat of a nuclear breakout. But at the end of the day, I think we're seeing the international community no longer put its faith in the words of the regime. JCPOA is falling apart and will fall apart. And this is where the Trump deal is the only deal, which is give up your nuclear enrichment capability to save yourself, or you will fall apart, which is just the way it's going to end up happening. Because I don't see how the regime is going to change its nature. Even in these desperate days, the regime has been unable to change its desperate nature and is sending all the wrong signals to the rest of the world. And it has fewer and fewer friends. The friends or the partners of convenience, Russia, China, North Korea, and Cuba and Venezuela, and all of these other players, they have their own problems. And they're less capable in propping up the regime. Now, I think as long as China can buy discounted oil, it will keep the regime hanging on by a thread. But, if China had to make a decision to make a deal with the United States or have a deal with Iran, I think, it will choose the deal with the United States any day. So, certainly President Trump has that as leverage over both countries. And I suspect that if push comes to shove and the regime continues to push its luck, President Trump is going to make good on his regime change post and is going to allow circumstances to fall in place that will no longer allow the regime to maintain power in the country.
And what would that look like, Len? Because, obviously, when you have, from a military perspective, each escalation is going to look different. There's going to be an escalation, so to speak. So what would the next round of war look like then with Iran? We saw, obviously, the nuclear facilities. What would the next thing be that would bring about regime change? Like, how would you go about doing that in terms of a military perspective for it to play out?
Well, I don't think necessarily that the regime change is going to come from outside. I think it has to come from the inside. I think no matter how much pressure the outside world puts on any malign regime, only the people themselves can decide to take the risks and bear the hardships of both the process of reinventing the country and going through the transition phase and standing up new rules of governing themselves. No outside entity can do that for the people. Now, I do think that with every day, the people are more and more willing to not only consider those things, but determine that they have no choice but to do those things because the future of their country cannot be invested in the regime of the Islamic Republic. Look, the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has sent signals to the people in the country through actually the very recent conference that he held in Germany, where a number of opposition groups sort of rallied around his leadership, have put their differences aside, and have determined that it's time for them to think about the next chapter. They clearly see that their future aligned in life after the regime. So I think the way this could happen is, the Crown Prince himself has said that he is looking to be a transitional figure that takes the serves as a bridge between where the country is today to where the people decide the country should go going forward. He talked about the three principles of territorial sovereignty, and he talked about the I'm trying to remember the specifics, but he talked about the various basic pillars of collaboration that the people will need to agree on to be able to transition to the next phase of the country. But regardless of what the regime wants or doesn't want, if the people decide that their future lies in a different arrangement and they're ready to no longer cooperate with the regime and work together to determine a compact, a social compact that positions them to collaborate together through another means of governance, whether it's a pure democracy, a republic, or whatever you have it. It's up to the people to decide that. It's up to all the factions on the ground to decide, what Iran looks like the day after. But the truth of the matter is that more and more the signs are there that the disparate opposition groups are putting their differences aside. They're coming together. They're trying to figure out a coherent plan to transition the country from where it is today to where it deserves to be. What that process looks like, is to be determined. I think there's some actually encouraging work that's being done in putting together a plan that scopes out the economic transition, the political transition, the cultural transition, the maintenance of the utilities and making sure things function in a country during the transition. All of those things are important because you don't want to end up in a situation where the country falls apart and chaotic and allows for malign actors to take the opportunity to take advantage of the situation. So I think, the prince and all of those collaborating with him are doing the right thing and the responsible thing by doing a lot of that planning ahead of time. But at the end of the day, as always, the people inside the country have to decide that they've had it and put their faith in themselves primarily and decide that, our future is more like the future promised by Cyrus the Great than by the regime. And I do believe that the 2,500 years of history that's rooted in the Cyrus template for Iran is the one that's going to transition the country toward the rest of its destiny and future. I think that 2,500 years versus the last 46 years of the regime is the blueprint for Iran going forward.
But if the Islamic Republic doesn't surrender, like you said, to this Trump deal, then Trump says that he'll take military action. What would that military action look like? I mean, if he's already decimated a lot of Iran's key nuclear facilities, what would the next round look like in terms of kinetic strategy?
Well, I don't know that. Look, I think President Trump views force as the last resort. I don't think he's going to use force unless he feels that America's interests are truly threatened. Now,
but if they don't surrender, what would he do if they don't come to a deal, like you said, that they're not going to change their nature?
Well, he's going to increase pressure. Okay. The maximum pressure is going to become unbearable pressure. And unbearable pressure, I question whether the regime can survive unbearable pressure. There's always more that could be done. Now, remember, maximum pressure of Trump 1.0 has succeeded in depleting Iranian regime's resources to the point where it was at the weakest point since the 79 revolution. Now, that was done without the cooperation of the European countries or the rest of the world. Now, imagine if the United States and the Europeans and our partners in the Middle East will band together to increase that pressure on Iran and make it much more difficult for China and Russia and Venezuela to purchase Iranian oil at a discount. You know, what's going to happen then? The regime is not going to have money to pay the besieged. It's not going to have the means to sustain its grip on power. And when there's no money and people are desperate, they're not going to stay allegiant to the regime that can't buy their allegiance. So and I think the President Trump is perfectly willing to play the long game when it comes to pressure. As long as there's no immediate threat to the American people, he's willing to play the long game. And I don't think the regime can play that long game. The Soviet Union could not play the long game when faced with the pressure from the Reagan administration. And I don't think the regime is going to have the fundamentals to withstand the pressure from the Trump administration, plus our friends and allies around the world.
Any concluding or final thoughts, Len?
I think the best days for Iran are in front of us. I do think that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And, I don't think the regime is long for this world. And I see the Iranian people regaining their rightful ability to determine their own destiny and join the rest of the world and fulfill the full potential of its own people and become a significant partner and significant beneficiary of being a full-fledged member of the international community. And I suspect the United States and our friends and allies will be right there to make sure that that becomes reality.
It's good to end things on a positive note. Thank you so much. That's Len Khodorkovsky joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thanks for having me.
You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.